On a winter night in 1955, somewhere in the black between Shannon and Gander, the flight engineer aboard a Trans-World Airlines Constellation leaned toward the window beside his panel and watched a torch of blue-white flame stream backward past the wing. He was not alarmed. He was reading it. The color of that flame told him things no gauge on his panel could report fast enough. Pale blue meant the mixture was sitting exactly where he wanted it. A sudden white glare meant something inside the exhaust system had begun to consume itself, and he had perhaps 90 seconds to shut that engine down before he lost it. 4 of those engines hung on that wing. Each made 3,400 horsepower from 18 cylinders in 2 rows of 9, and each carried 3 turbine wheels spinning at 19,000 revolutions per minute in exhaust gas hot enough to glow in daylight. This was the Wright R3350 Duplex-Cyclone turbo compound. No production aircraft piston engine has ever bettered its fuel efficiency. It made the Lockheed Constellation and the Douglas DC-7 the fastest propeller airliners ever built. It was also the machine that convinced the airline industry to abandon pistons altogether. That is the question worth sitting with. Not why the jet won. Why the finest piston engine ever built made the case against pistons impossible to argue with. But before we get into the wreckage of this program, I want to ask you for something small. We put an enormous amount of work into these deep dives, digging through maintenance records, service bulletins, airworthiness directives, and engineering documents that most people never see. And when I look at our analytics, the overwhelming majority of you watching right now are not subscribed. It is a tiny thing on your end. It takes 2 seconds, and it costs you absolutely nothing. But it helps us an enormous amount, because it is the only reason a channel like this stays alive and gets to keep doing this properly. So if you want more of these, hit that subscribe button right now. Thank you. Now, back to the hangar. To understand why Wright Aeronautical built something this complicated, look at what the airlines were demanding in 1950, and at the fact that nobody could deliver it. The problem was geographic, and it was regulatory. The prevailing winds over North America run west to east. Flying from Los Angeles to New York was easy work. The tailwind pushed a Douglas DC-6 across the continent in comfortable time. The westbound return, punching into the winter jet stream, kept running into a rule. The Civil Aeronautics Board enforced an 8-hour limit on domestic flight crews. Cross it, and the airline was legally required to carry a relief crew, a third pilot, and a second flight engineer on the payroll for every transcontinental sector. It destroyed the margin on the most prestigious route in American aviation. C.R. Smith, who ran American Airlines and was not a patient man, watched Howard Hughes put Lockheed Super Constellations onto the same routes and start taking his market share. Smith went to Donald Douglas and demanded something faster. Douglas refused. He knew turbine power was coming and saw no sense in spending a fortune on another piston airliner. Smith threatened to move his entire fleet order to Lockheed, and Douglas folded. Across the Atlantic, the same pressure was building. Juan Trippe at Pan American wanted an aircraft that could fly New York to Paris in both directions, year-round, at full payload, without stopping. Every refueling stop in Gander or Shannon meant landing fees, ground crews, and block time. Block time is the clock from gate departure to gate arrival, and it is what determines whether an airliner makes money. 2 hours on the ground in Newfoundland is 2 hours the aircraft earns nothing. So the airlines went to the engine manufacturers and asked for more power. The engine manufacturers explained that they had run out of room. The problem was a spiral every engineer in the industry could recite. A bigger engine burns more fuel. More fuel means bigger tanks, more weight, more lift, a bigger wing, more drag, and therefore more power. By 1949, the large radial had been pushed about as far as displacement alone could carry it. Pratt & Whitney's answer had been the R4360, 28 cylinders in 4 rows, and its maintenance bill was already frightening every accounting department that met one. Wright Aeronautical looked at the same wall and asked a completely different question. Their engineers had known for decades that a piston engine is, thermodynamically, a machine that mostly makes heat. Roughly half the chemical energy in a gallon of high-octane aviation gasoline never reaches the propeller. It leaves through the exhaust stack as pressure and temperature and noise, dumped into the sky at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit and thrown away. Nobody was using it. Not because anyone thought it was worthless, but because nobody had built a practical way to catch it. And on paper, the solution Wright arrived at was genuinely brilliant. This is worth saying clearly, because everything that follows is a demolition, and the engineers deserve their due first. They identified the single largest inefficiency in the entire power plant, designed a mechanism to recover a meaningful fraction of it, and it worked exactly as the physics said it would. It produced roughly 550 additional horsepower without consuming a single extra drop of fuel. It lifted the engine's takeoff rating to 3,400 horsepower, a gain of about 20%, and it drove brake-specific fuel consumption down near 0.38 pounds of fuel per horsepower hour, putting a spark-ignition aero engine into territory occupied by diesels. That number is why the Constellation and the DC-7 could do what nothing else could: carry 75 passengers from New York to Paris against a winter headwind without landing. The turbo compound did not win by brute force. It made non-stop range mathematically possible. Understanding how it did that requires understanding what actually happens at the moment a cylinder finishes its work. Inside an 18-cylinder radial, the sequence is the one every engine follows. Fuel and air are drawn in, compressed, ignited, and the expanding gas drives the piston down the bore and turns the crankshaft. But the stroke ends long before the gas has finished expanding. The exhaust valve opens while the contents of that cylinder are still under substantial pressure and still glowing hot, and all of that energy blows straight out into the manifold. A supercharger takes power off the crankshaft to compress incoming air. A turbocharger uses exhaust gas to drive a compressor doing the same job. Both improve how much air the engine can swallow. Neither adds energy back into the crankshaft. Wright's power recovery turbine did something different. It took the exhaust and turned it back into torque. The engine carried three, spaced evenly around the rear of the crankcase. Each was fed by the exhaust of 6 cylinders, routed through its own manifold and aimed directly at the turbine wheel. And critically, these were blowdown turbines. They were not built to run on a smooth, continuous flow of gas. They were built to harvest the violent individual pressure pulse produced each time an exhaust valve slammed open, 6 times per turbine per crankshaft revolution. Those pulses drove the turbine wheels to 19,000 revolutions per minute, which created the central mechanical problem of the design. At takeoff power, the crankshaft turned at roughly 2,900 revolutions per minute. The turbines were spinning more than 6 times faster. Bridging that gap took a train of bevel gears at about 6.5 to 1, and connecting them rigidly was out of the question. A radial engine does not accelerate smoothly. It backfires. It surges. A solid link between a 19,000 RPM turbine and a crankshaft that can jolt would shear its own gear teeth on the first disturbance. So Wright put a fluid coupling in the path. Each turbine drove through a hydraulic connection, transmitting torque through a viscous link rather than metal teeth, absorbing every shock before it could reach the gear train. The engine was, in the most literal sense, drinking its own exhaust and turning it back into thrust. 3 turbines, 3 fluid couplings, 3 sets of bevel gears, hanging off an engine that already had 18 cylinders, 36 valves, and a supercharger to look after. And every one of those additions bought power by creating a problem that had not existed before. It was a closed loop, and it tightened at every step. Solve one issue, and the solution generated a costlier one. Start with the turbines themselves. To extract energy from exhaust gas, A turbine has to stand in its way. That restriction raised back pressure inside the exhaust system, and back pressure works its way straight into the cylinders. An engine that cannot scavenge cleanly runs hotter, because residual hot gas stays put instead of leaving, which took the exhaust valves to their limit. The R3350 already used sodium-filled valve stems, a clever piece of engineering in which liquid sodium sloshes inside the hollow stem and draws heat off the valve head. Under turbo compound back pressure, those valves sat at the edge of what the metallurgy of the period could survive. Push the mixture slightly too lean, and cylinder head temperature spiked. A valve would stretch, then warp, then let go, and the engine would ingest the wreckage of its own valve head and tear itself apart from the inside. Now consider what the turbines were sitting in. Gas at the turbine inlet routinely exceeded 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, and on a hard climb it went higher. 1950s foundry practice could produce alloys that survived that, but not cheaply, and not with the consistency required of a component running for hundreds of hours. And the engine had a weight budget. So parts of the recovery turbine assembly were made from magnesium, which is remarkably light, and which, once it catches, burns at a temperature that standard carbon dioxide and halon suppression cannot touch. Then there was the vibration. A steady gas flow is kind to a turbine wheel. An intermittent hammer of 6 distinct exhaust pulses per revolution is not. Those pulses arrived unevenly, loaded the blades unevenly, and worked relentlessly at the bearings. When a bearing degraded the seal, around it leaked, and lubricating oil found its way into a gas stream at 1500 degrees. That was the blowtorch the flight engineer was watching out of his window. That was the white glare. And to keep all of this inside its narrow survivable band, the engine demanded constant attention from a human being, not periodic checks. Continuous management, minute by minute, for 14 hours at a stretch, which meant a dedicated flight engineer on every flight, a full-time seat, and a full-time salary on every sector the aircraft ever flew. 550 free horsepower, purchased with 3 fluid couplings, 3 gear trains, 3 turbine bearings, a magnesium fire risk, an exhaust valve at the edge of its metallurgy, and a man on the payroll whose entire job was to stop the engine destroying itself. Given the operating costs and the compromises involved, was the design approach actually worth it for the airlines? Let me know what you think in the comments. The real answer is not in the air. It is on a ramp at Kansas City, where Trans World Airlines ran its overhaul base, at 3 in the morning. A Constellation coming off the Atlantic did not simply refuel and leave. Between them, the engines carried 72 cylinders running 2 spark plugs each, 144 plugs on every airframe. The aviation gasoline of the period was heavily dosed with tetraethyl lead to prevent detonation, and that lead condensed onto plug electrodes whenever the engines ran at low power, which is to say, during every descent and every taxi. A plug fouled during the run-up sent the aircraft back to the gate, and mechanics went at the cowlings with the metal still hot enough to blister a palm, because the departure slot was not going to wait. Then there was oil. A large radial is assembled with deliberately loose internal clearances, so components can expand as they heat, which means it consumes oil continuously by design. A healthy turbo compound, in perfect condition, burned 2 to 3 gallons of heavy aviation oil every hour. 4 engines across a 12-hour crossing meant well over 100 gallons on a single flight. The aircraft carried reserve tanks in the wings, and the flight engineer transferred fresh oil into the engines through valves while cruising over the middle of the ocean. The aprons at every base these aircraft touched were permanently black and never fully dry. And when a recovery turbine failed outright, which happened often enough that airlines planned around it, there was no workaround. The engine came off. A Constellation that shut one down over the Atlantic and diverted meant 75 passengers in hotel rooms at company expense, a replacement power plant chartered out on a freighter, and mechanics dispatched to change an engine on a foreign ramp. 3 days out of revenue service on a flagship aircraft, and the money it was supposed to earn never appeared on the ledger. Time between overhaul, the interval an engine may run before it is stripped and rebuilt, started low on the turbo compound and climbed only slowly as operators learned it. Airlines measured the burden in maintenance man-hours per flight hour, and on this engine the flying was, in a real accounting sense, subsidizing the wrenching. The men who flew behind it had a phrase for what all of this added up to. They called the Constellation and the DC-7 the finest three-engine airliners in the world. Both aircraft had four. Up on the flight deck, the flight engineer sat sideways to a wall of instruments that had almost nothing to do with navigation. The gauge that governed his life measured brake mean effective pressure, the average pressure developed inside the cylinders during the power stroke, and it was the closest thing he had to a direct reading of how hard the engine was working. Around it sat cylinder head temperature, carburetor air temperature, oil temperature and oil pressure for 4 separate power plants, plus the cowl flap and oil cooler controls he worked continuously to manage cooling airflow. His job was a tightrope with a fall on both sides. To make the fuel numbers work westbound, he had to lean the mixture aggressively, taking the engines toward their most efficient operating point. Lean too far, and cylinder head temperature climbed. A valve let go, and he had destroyed a power plant. Run rich enough to keep everything cool, and the aircraft would not reach its destination, which meant an unscheduled stop and a conversation with the operations department. He walked that line for 14 hours. Down the back, none of this was visible. Trans World Airlines marketed its long-range Constellations under the name Jetstream, deliberate misdirection aimed at passengers who had begun to associate the word jet with modernity. The cabin was divided into compartments to break up the sensation of sitting in a tube, with fully reclining sleeper berths, wool blankets, and multi-course meals cooked in a proper galley and served on china with silver. And then the sun went down, and the passengers on the wing side looked out at 4 exhaust systems glowing cherry red in the dark, occasionally throwing tongues of blue and white flame several feet into the night. Cabin crews were fielding so many alarmed questions that airlines eventually instructed them to make an announcement before nightfall, explaining that flames visible outside the window were entirely normal and nothing to be concerned about. Which was true, most of the time. It was also the reason nobody rang the call bell on the occasions when the magnesium actually had begun to burn. While Wright was building this, Pratt & Whitney was watching, and Pratt & Whitney made a completely different bet. The two firms had been the poles of American aero engine manufacturing for 30 years. Both could see the same thermodynamic wall. Both had the depth to attempt exhaust energy recovery. Pratt & Whitney chose not to. They pushed their capital and their best people into gas turbines, and by mid-decade were developing the JT3, the engine that would hang under the wing of the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8. The comparison is worth making on parts alone, because that is where the argument was actually settled. A turbo-compound R3350 contained 18 pistons, 18 connecting rods, a master rod assembly for each row, 36 valves with their springs and rockers and push rods, a 2-speed supercharger, 3 turbine wheels, 3 fluid couplings, and 3 gear trains, every part of it reciprocating or spinning against something else. An early turbojet had a compressor and a turbine on a common shaft, one primary rotating assembly. Reciprocating parts wear against each other in ways that are hard to predict and expensive to inspect. Rotating assemblies wear too, but slowly and along one axis. That difference is the entire economic story of the jet age, and it had almost nothing to do with speed. Wright saw it late. Curtiss-Wright, under Roy Hurley, poured its resources into refining the piston engine it already had and into ventures outside aviation, and never produced a jet engine that mattered. The company carrying the name of the men who invented powered flight was out of the aircraft engine business within 15 years of building the finest one anybody ever made. The execution, when it came, was not gradual. Run the arithmetic the way an airline treasurer ran it in 1959. Because an airliner is a factory that manufactures seat miles, and its only real metric is how many it produces in 24 hours. A Constellation carried around 75 passengers at roughly 350 miles an hour, and New York to Paris took about 14. Add the ground time to service 4 turbo compounds, inspect plugs, replenish 100 gallons of oil, and clear whatever the flight engineer had written up, and the aircraft managed 1 crossing per day. A Boeing 707 carried around 140 passengers at close to 600 miles an hour and made the same crossing in about 7. It landed, took on kerosene that cost less than high-octane aviation gasoline, changed crews, and went back the other way. One jet completed a full round trip in the time a Constellation flew one leg, carrying nearly twice as many people. 3 to 4 times the daily revenue from a single airframe. There was no version of the piston airliner that survived that number. Airlines that had ordered advanced piston equipment began paying penalty clauses simply to cancel and free capital for delivery slots on jets. Aircraft that cost close to $2 million new were offered for a fraction of that within 4 years, and buyers were scarce, because smaller carriers knew exactly what a turbo compound fleet involved and wanted no part of it. Then came the indignity. Late-model Constellations and DC-7s went to conversion shops, where the murals came off the bulkheads, the berths and galleys were torn out, floors were reinforced with extruded aluminium tracking, and cargo doors were cut into fuselages that had been carrying people in silver service 4 years earlier. As freighters, they were useful for a while, because cargo operators could run the engines at lower power settings, treating them with a sympathy no passenger schedule ever permitted. It did not last. As first-generation jets depreciated and filtered into the freight market, the piston fleets were pushed out on maintenance cost alone, and by the early 1970s, most sat in the desert waiting for the scrappers. The military held on longer because it was buying capability rather than cost per ton mile. Turbo compound R-3350s flew in the Lockheed P-2 Neptune and the EC-121 Warning Star, the radar picket conversion of the Super Constellation, and those aircraft were still working into the 1970s. A small number still run today, on preserved airframes, in the hands of people who know how to keep them alive. It is easy to file the turbo compound as a dead end, an over-engineered curiosity from a company that failed to see the jet age coming. That reading is comfortable, and it is wrong. Wright's engineers set out to do one thing: recover a meaningful fraction of the energy their engine was throwing away, without burning more fuel. They achieved it completely. The brake-specific fuel consumption they reached has not been bettered by any production aircraft piston engine since, and they got there with slide rules, cast magnesium, and 1950s metallurgy. And the idea did not die. It was waiting for materials that could survive it. Turbo compounding came back in the 1980s in heavy truck diesels, where an exhaust-driven turbine geared into the crankshaft does precisely what Wright's power recovery turbines did, with alloys and bearings that did not exist in 1950. It runs today on highway engines from Scania and Detroit Diesel, and the most sophisticated version of the idea anywhere on Earth sits in the back of a Formula One power unit, where the MGU-H harvests exhaust energy and returns it to the drivetrain as electricity. They were not wrong about the physics. They were 40 years early, applying a sound principle with materials not ready to carry it. There is a point at which an efficiency gain stops being an engineering problem and becomes a labor problem, and Wright found it. The 3 turbines recovered 550 horsepower and handed it back to the crankshaft for free. The invoice arrived somewhere else entirely. It arrived at 3 in the morning, on a black apron in Kansas City, in the hands of a man with a torque wrench and a departure time. If you found this useful, a like genuinely helps more people find these deep dives. Thanks for watching.